The lawyer's words echoed through the mahogany-paneled office as my father Joshua sat rigid in his leather chair. Your late wife held separate assets totaling $23 million. They transfer entirely to her daughter. My half-siblings, Emma and Vernon, who had been smirking moments before about inheriting everything from Dad's estate, now stared in shock. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother, who passed away when I was 12, had been secretly wealthy. For 16 years, I had believed we were just middle class. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. My name is Mike, and at 28 years old, I thought I understood my place in this fractured family. Growing up after my mother Sarah's death had been like walking through a minefield blindfolded. She died from cancer when I was 12, leaving me alone with my father Joshua, who seemed to withdraw into himself like a turtle retreating into its shell. 3 years later, when I was 15, everything changed again. Joshua married Patricia, a divorced woman with 2 children of her own. Emma was 13 then, and Vernon was 11. Suddenly, our quiet house filled with noise, laughter, and an energy that felt foreign to me. But that energy was never directed my way. Patricia made it clear from day one that her biological children came first. She would cook elaborate dinners for Emma and Vernon, while leaving me a sandwich on the counter. When shopping for school clothes, she would take them to expensive department stores, while handing me $40 in directions to the discount outlet across town. Emma received a brand new Honda Civic for her 16th birthday, complete with a red bow on top and a party with 30 friends. Vernon got a lifted pickup truck when he turned 16, along with insurance payments covered by Dad. When my 16th birthday arrived, I received a card with $50 inside and a pat on the shoulder. College was the same story. Emma attended a private university in California, with Dad covering her full tuition room and board, plus a generous monthly allowance for spending money. Vernon chose a state school, but still received full financial support, including a credit card for emergencies that somehow always had a $1,000 balance. I worked 3 part-time jobs throughout high school, saving every penny I could scrape together. My guidance counselor helped me apply for scholarships and student loans. Dad contributed exactly nothing to my education, claiming that I needed to learn responsibility and self-reliance. The irony wasn't lost on me that his biological stepchildren received everything while his actual son received lectures about character building through hardship. After college, I moved to a small apartment across town, working as an accountant for a local firm. I visited Dad maybe twice a year, always feeling like an unwelcome guest in what used to be my childhood home. Emma and Vernon still lived there, part-time, treating it like a free hotel with maid service. 2 weeks ago, Dad suffered a massive heart attack at 58 while mowing the lawn. Patricia called me 3 hours after the paramedics declared him dead. Her voice carried no emotion when she said, "Your father passed away this morning. The funeral is Saturday. The will reading is next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I shouldn't have been surprised by her coldness, but something about hearing my father reduced to your father instead of Joshua or even my husband struck me as particularly cruel. Now here I sat in attorney Benjamin Hartwell's office, surrounded by burgundy law books and the smell of old leather. Patricia sat directly across from me, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Emma and Vernon flanked her like bodyguards, both dressed in designer suits that Dad must have purchased for them. Hartwell was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that trembled slightly as he unfolded the legal documents. He had known our family for years, having handled Dad's business affairs since before I was born. "Thank you all for coming today." Hartwell began, his voice carrying the practiced solemnity of someone who had delivered countless pieces of life-altering news. "Joshua's will is straightforward in most respects. Let me read the relevant portion." He cleared his throat and began reading in a formal tone that made every word feel like a small knife. "I, Joshua Michael Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby leave my entire estate valued at approximately $4.7 million to my biological children, Emma Patricia Morrison and Vernon James Morrison, to be divided equally between them upon reaching the age of 25. My stomach dropped, but he continued reading the most devastating part. My stepson Mike receives nothing from this estate, as he is not of my blood and has never truly been part of this family. I have provided for him during his childhood, and I consider my obligations complete. Emma barely suppressed a giggle. Vernon's smile stretched so wide it looked painful. Patricia maintained her poker face, but I caught a glimpse of satisfaction in her eyes. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not of my blood. Never truly been part of this family. 16 years after my mother's death, my father had found a legal way to disown me completely. Is that everything? Patricia asked, already reaching for her purse, as if this meeting was nothing more than a routine appointment. But Hartwell held up one finger, his expression shifting slightly. Actually, there's an additional matter we need to discuss. Attorney Hartwell reached into a separate folder, one that looked older and more worn than the documents he had just read from. His demeanor changed, becoming more careful and deliberate, as he extracted a sealed envelope. There's something else, he said, adjusting his glasses. Your mother, Sarah Thompson, maintained separate assets that were unknown to Joshua. These assets were held in a private trust that I administered independently. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the bookshelf behind Hartwell's desk. Patricia leaned forward, her mask of indifference slipping for the first time. What kind of separate assets? She demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Hartwell opened the envelope carefully, as if it contained something precious and fragile. Sarah inherited a substantial trust fund from her maternal grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, shortly before Mike's birth. However, she chose to keep this inheritance completely separate from the marital assets. My mind raced back to memories of my mother trying to recall any signs of hidden wealth. She had always been careful with money shopping at discount stores and clipping coupons. Our house was comfortable but modest. We drove used cars and took vacations to state parks, not exotic destinations. Sarah was very specific about protecting these assets. Hartwell continued unfolding a document that looked like it had been written on expensive paper. She established what's called a spendthrift trust, which protected the principal from any claims by creditors, including potential future marital disputes. Vernon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. How much money are we talking about? Hartwell's answer hit the room like a thunderbolt. The trust assets, including 28 years of compound growth and conservative investments, are now valued at approximately $23 million. Patricia gasped audibly. Emma's mouth fell open so wide I could see her dental work. Vernon looked like he had been struck by lightning. I felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting under my feet. $23 million. My mother, who had darned my socks and made me pack lunches to save money, had been worth $23 million. The trust documents specify that these assets transfer to her daughter upon Joshua's death or remarriage, whichever occurred first. Hartwell explained, reading from the legal document. Since Joshua remarried Patricia, the trust became active at that time, but Sarah chose to keep it dormant until Joshua's passing. Patricia stood up so quickly, her chair rolled backward. Her daughter Sarah only had one child, and that's Mike. You made an error in the documentation. I assure you, Mrs. Morrison, there is no error, Hartwell replied calmly. The language was very carefully chosen by Sarah herself. Emma found her voice first. This doesn't make sense. Sarah had a son, not a daughter. The money should be divided among all of us since we're family now. The trust is very specific, Hartwell said, pulling out another document. It references my beloved daughter in multiple places throughout the paperwork. Sarah was extremely particular about this language. My head was spinning, Daughter, I looked around the room at everyone's confused faces, feeling like I was missing some crucial piece of information. Patricia's voice turned venomous. This is obviously a mistake. Sarah was confused or the paperwork was filled out incorrectly. We'll contest this in court. Hartwell remained unflappable. Mrs. Morrison, I drafted these documents personally under Sarah's direct supervision. She was very clear about her intentions and the specific language she wanted used. Vernon leaned forward aggressively. So what happens now? How does this get resolved? The matter is quite clear, Hartwell replied. The trust transfers to Sarah's daughter as specified. However, I do need to meet privately with Mike tomorrow morning to review some additional documentation that was kept in Sarah's private safe deposit box. Patricia's face flushed red. Private meeting. Why can't we all hear whatever needs to be discussed? Because the additional documentation pertains specifically to Mike's inheritance and contains personal information that Sarah wanted to remain confidential. Hartwell explained with professional firmness. The room erupted in arguments. Patricia accused Hartwell of incompetence and favoritism. Emma demanded to see all the trust documents immediately. Vernon threatened to hire his own attorney to challenge the whole arrangement. Through all the chaos, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My mother had hidden $23 million from my father. She had somehow known that I would need protection after her death. But why had she referred to me as her daughter in legal documents? Hartwell finally raised his voice above the commotion. I understand this is unexpected news for everyone. Mike, can you be here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock? We'll review everything privately and determine the next steps. I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. Patricia gathered her purse and coat with sharp, angry movements. This isn't over. We're going to fight this with everything we have. Emma and Vernon followed her toward the door, both throwing accusatory glances back at me, as if I had somehow orchestrated this surprise. Mike. Emma said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I hope you remember that we're still family despite what some old paperwork says. It would be really nice if you shared this windfall with people who actually cared about Dad. Vernon nodded emphatically. Yeah, man, Dad raised you and everything. The right thing to do would be to split this equally among all of us kids. I watched them leave without responding, my mind too overwhelmed to form coherent thoughts. Patricia turned back one last time from the doorway. Don't think this makes you special, Mike. Money doesn't change the fact that you were never really Joshua's son. After they left Hartwell, and I sat in heavy silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke softly. Your mother was a remarkable woman. She loved you very much, and she was very worried about protecting your future. Tomorrow, everything will become much clearer. I drove home to my small apartment in a daze, my mind spinning with questions that had no answers. My mother had been wealthy beyond my imagination, but she had lived like any middle-class mom. She had somehow known that my father would remarry and that I would need protection. And she had called me her daughter in legal documents for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. That night, I pulled out every photo album and box of keepsakes from my childhood, searching for clues about my mother's secret life and trying to understand why she had used such strange language in her will. I arrived at Hartwell's office the next morning 15 minutes early, my nerves frayed from a sleepless night spent wondering what other secrets would be revealed. The receptionist offered me coffee, but my stomach was already churning too much to handle caffeine. Hartwell greeted me with a gentleness that seemed different from his professional demeanor the day before. He led me into his office and closed the door, then walked over to a small safe hidden behind a painting of a lighthouse. Mike, what I'm about to share with you will be difficult to process. He began removing several sealed envelopes and a small metal box. Your mother asked me to wait until after Joshua's death to reveal this information, believing that you would be mature enough to handle it and strong enough to defend yourself if necessary. He placed the items on his desk carefully, as if they were made of spun glass. Before we open these, I want you to know that Sarah loved you unconditionally. Everything she did was to protect you and ensure your happiness and safety. My hands trembled slightly as I watched him break the seal on the first envelope. Inside was a document I had never seen before: my original birth certificate from the state of Michigan. Hartwell handed it to me silently, and I read the information with growing confusion. The certificate showed my birth date correctly, and Sarah's name as the mother. Joshua was listed as the father, but the name on the certificate read Michelle Sarah Thompson, and the sex was marked as female. I stared at the document for a long moment, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. There's been some kind of mistake. This says Michelle, not Mike, and it says female. Hartwell's voice was extraordinarily gentle. Mike, this is your original birth certificate. You were born female, but you transitioned to male when you were 3 years old. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the room spin slightly as I gripped the edge of the desk. That's impossible. I don't remember anything like that. I've always been Mike. Your parents consulted with pediatric specialists when you were very young because you consistently expressed that you were a boy, not a girl. Hartwell explained, opening the second envelope. This contains medical records and photos documenting your early transition. He showed me a thick file filled with doctor's notes, psychological evaluations, and photographs. The photos showed a toddler who looked exactly like me, but was dressed in frilly dresses and had longer hair with pink bows. My voice came out as a whisper. I don't remember any of this. That's completely normal, Hartwell said reassuringly. Most people don't have clear memories from before age 4 or 5. Your parents worked with specialists to make your transition as smooth and natural as possible. By the time you started school, all your documents reflected your male identity. I flipped through the medical records, seeing notes about hormone blockers therapy sessions and legal name changes. Everything was documented in meticulous detail, showing a careful and loving process overseen by experienced professionals. Sarah was incredibly supportive of your identity from the very beginning, Hartwell continued. These letters explain her thought process and her fears about the future. He handed me a stack of handwritten letters in my mother's familiar script. I opened the first one with shaking hands and began reading her words written when I was 4 years old. My precious son Mike is so happy now that everyone sees him the way he sees himself. The doctors say we made the right choice to support his transition early. He's confident, playful, and secure in his identity. My only worry is what might happen if Joshua ever turns against him. I pray that my husband will always love our son regardless, but I've seen how cruel the world can be to people who are different. The next letter was dated 2 years later. Mike is thriving in 1st grade. His teacher has no idea about his medical history, and none of the other children treat him as anything other than a regular boy. Dr. Patterson says this is the best possible outcome. However, I've noticed that Joshua sometimes seems uncomfortable when Mike displays behavior that he considers too feminine, like choosing art over sports or preferring quiet activities. I worry about what messages Mike is receiving. I read letter after letter, watching my mother's growing concern about my father's potential rejection if he ever learned about my transgender identity. In one particularly heartbreaking entry from when I was 8, she wrote, Joshua made a comment today about being glad that Mike is turning out normal and not one of those confused kids you hear about. My heart broke. He has no idea that Mike is exactly one of those kids, and that Mike is perfect just the way he is. I'm more convinced than ever that I need to protect Mike's inheritance separately. If Joshua ever finds out the truth, he might reject Mike completely. The final letter was dated just 6 months before my mother's death. The trust is now established and ironclad. No matter what happens to me or to Joshua, Mike will be financially secure. The lawyers have confirmed that because Mike was legally born female and transitioned with full medical supervision, he qualifies as my daughter under the law, even though he lives as my son. This technicality will protect the inheritance from anyone who might challenge Mike's right to it based on his gender identity. I set the letters down my hands, shaking so badly I could barely hold them. Everything about my childhood suddenly made sense, the occasional awkward moments with my father, when I didn't live up to his masculine expectations, my mother's fierce protectiveness, and the way certain memories seemed hazy or unclear. The inheritance law is complex, Hartwell explained, but Sarah's attorney was very clever. Legally, you qualify as her daughter because that's how you were born, regardless of your current gender presentation. The trust was specifically designed to transfer to you upon Joshua's death, and no one else has any legal claim to it. I looked up at him feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had learned. Does this mean Patricia and her kids have no case if they try to challenge the inheritance? Correct. The trust is airtight, and your legal documentation supports your claim completely. However, there's something else you need to know. Hartwell's expression grew more serious. Patricia hired a private investigator 6 months ago to look into your background. We believe she suspected that Sarah had hidden assets, and she's been trying to find any leverage she could use against you. My blood ran cold. She knows about my transition. It's possible. Private investigators can sometimes access sealed records through questionable means. You need to be prepared for the possibility that she might try to use this information against you. I spent the next hour reviewing all the documentation with Hartwell, understanding the full scope of my mother's planning and foresight. She had anticipated every possible challenge and had protected me in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. As I prepared to leave, Hartwell handed me one final envelope. Sarah asked me to give you this after you learned everything else. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message in my mother's handwriting. My dearest Mike, you are perfect exactly as you are. I loved you from the moment you told me you were my son, and I will love you forever. Use this gift to live your truth proudly and to help other children who need support. You are brave, you are loved, and you deserve every happiness. Love always, Mom. I walked out of Hartwell's office feeling like a completely different person than the one who had walked in. I had learned that I was transgender, that my mother had been secretly wealthy, and that she had spent years planning to protect me from a world that might not accept me. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that I had been deeply and unconditionally loved. I made it exactly 2 blocks from Hartwell's office before my phone started ringing. Patricia's name flashed on the screen, and I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told me I needed to face whatever was coming. "We need to talk," she said without any greeting. Her voice carried a coldness that made my skin crawl. "I'm at your apartment. Emma and Vernon are with me." My stomach dropped. "How did you get my address?" "We have our ways. Get here now or we're going to start making phone calls to people you work with." The line went dead, and I stood on the sidewalk feeling like I was about to walk into a trap. But running away wouldn't solve anything, and I needed to know exactly what Patricia had discovered. 25 minutes later, I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot and saw Patricia's luxury SUV parked directly in front of my building. She was leaning against the driver's side door, like she owned the place, while Emma and Vernon sat on the steps leading to my front door. "There he is," Vernon announced loudly enough for the entire complex to hear. "The lying little fraud." I approached them cautiously, my keys ready in my hand. "What do you want?" Patricia pushed herself off the car and walked toward me with the predatory grace of a shark circling wounded prey. "Oh, I think you know exactly what we want. We want to discuss this little inheritance situation and how you're going to make it right." "There's nothing to discuss. The lawyers have explained everything." Emma stood up from the steps, and I noticed she was holding a manila folder stuffed with papers. "Actually, there's quite a lot to discuss. You see, we hired someone to look into your background. Very interesting discoveries." My heart rate spiked, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Patricia's smile was absolutely venomous. Tell me, Mike, when exactly were you planning to mention that you used to be Michelle? When were you going to tell everyone that your whole identity is a lie? The words hit me like a slap across the face, but I forced myself not to react visibly. I don't have to tell you anything about my personal life. Vernon joined the conversation with a snort of cruel laughter. Personal life? This isn't personal, this is fraud. You've been pretending to be a man your whole life, taking advantage of people who didn't know the truth. That's not how it works. I said, my anger starting to override my fear. I am a man. I've been legally male since I was 3 years old. Patricia pulled out her phone and held it up like a weapon. Really, because I have copies of your original birth certificate right here. I also have photos of you in little dresses and pigtails. I wonder how your co-workers would react if they saw these images. Emma waved the manila folder in my face. We know everything. The medical records, the therapy sessions, the hormone treatments. You're not really Joshua's son at all. You're just some confused girl who tricked our family into accepting you. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. These people had known me for over a decade, had eaten dinner at the same table with me thousands of times, and they were talking about me like I was some kind of imposter. Joshua never would have accepted you if he knew the truth. Patricia continued. He believed in traditional values, traditional families. He would have been disgusted to learn what you really are. Vernon stepped closer to me, trying to use his height as an intimidation tactic. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over that inheritance to the people who actually deserve it. Split it 3 ways between Emma, myself, and Patricia. Or we start making some very public announcements about your little secret. I looked around the parking lot, noticing that several neighbors had come out of their apartments to watch the confrontation. Mrs. Patterson from Unit 12 was pretending to check her mailbox, while obviously eavesdropping. The college students in Unit 8 were sitting on their balcony with beers, treating the whole thing like entertainment. You're threatening to blackmail me, I said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. We're offering you a choice. Patricia corrected her voice, dripping with false reasonableness. You can do the right thing and share the money with Joshua's real family, or you can face the consequences of your deception. Emma opened the manila folder and pulled out what looked like copies of medical records. We have documentation of every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every prescription. We know about the hormone blockers, the psychological evaluations, even the summer camp for gender-variant children that you attended when you were 7. My privacy had been completely violated, my most personal medical information stolen and weaponized against me. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that made me want to run and hide. The private investigator we hired was very thorough, Vernon added with obvious satisfaction. He found sealed records that most people would never be able to access. Amazing what money can buy these days. Patricia pulled up something on her phone screen. I've already drafted emails to send to your employer, your landlord, and several of your high school classmates. All it takes is one button push to let everyone know what you've been hiding. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. I realized that this wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. They were trying to destroy my entire life, my career, and my reputation, because I had something they wanted. And don't think you can just ignore us and hope we'll go away, Emma said with a smile that would have made a viper proud. We know where you work. We know where you go to church. We know which gym you belong to. We can make your life very uncomfortable very quickly. Vernon nodded enthusiastically. I've got friends who would love to help spread the word about the neighborhood freak. Amazing how fast news travels in a small town. I stood there for a moment, processing the full scope of their attack. They weren't just threatening to reveal my transgender identity. They were threatening to turn my entire community against me through harassment and misinformation. But something interesting happened as I listened to their threats. Instead of feeling more afraid, I started feeling angry. These people were trying to destroy me because they couldn't stand the thought of me having something they wanted. They were willing to commit crimes and hurt an innocent person because of their own greed and prejudice. "You have 48 hours to make your decision," Patricia announced like she was delivering an ultimatum from on high. "Sign over the inheritance or we start our campaign to let everyone know exactly what you are." With that, they climbed back into Patricia's SUV and drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot surrounded by curious neighbors who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Mrs. Patterson approached me cautiously. "Honey, are you all right? Those people seemed very upset about something." I looked at her kind, worried face and realized that Patricia had made a serious tactical error. She had chosen to threaten me publicly in front of witnesses who could see exactly what kind of people they were dealing with. "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson. Thank you for asking. Those people are just angry about a family inheritance issue." "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me," she said, patting my arm gently. "And honey, I don't care what anybody says about you. You've always been nothing but polite and helpful to everyone in this building." As I walked up the steps to my apartment, I realized that Patricia's threats had backfired in an unexpected way. Instead of making me feel isolated and alone, they had reminded me that I had allies and support systems that she knew nothing about. But more importantly, they had shown me that they were willing to break the laws and hurt innocent people to get what they wanted. And that gave me something I hadn't had before, a reason to fight back. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Patricia hadn't been bluffing about starting her campaign immediately. She had somehow gotten my personal phone number and distributed it to people who were now calling me at all hours with accusations and threats. The messages ranged from confused friends asking if the rumors they were hearing were true to strangers who had gotten my number from social media and wanted to share their opinions about transgender people. Most disturbing were the messages that contained detailed threats about what would happen to me if I didn't leave town. I realized that Patricia's private investigator had done more than just gather information about my medical history. He had created a comprehensive dossier of my personal contacts, social media connections, and daily routines. But instead of panicking, I decided to fight back systematically. I started by documenting everything: screenshots of the threatening messages, recordings of the voicemails, and detailed notes about the confrontation in my parking lot. If Patricia wanted to play dirty, I would make sure there was evidence of every illegal thing she did. I called Hartwell's office and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Then, I did something that surprised even me. I called a forensic accountant that I knew from my own job and asked him to look into Joshua's financial records. I think my stepmother might have been stealing from my father. I explained to David Chen, who specialized in uncovering financial fraud for divorce and estate cases. I need to know if there are any irregularities in his accounts over the past few years. David agreed to take the case on contingency, meaning he would only get paid if we found evidence of actual crimes. Within 6 hours, he called me back with preliminary findings that made my hands shake. "Mike, this is worse than you thought. I found evidence of systematic withdrawal from your father's investment accounts, dating back almost 5 years. Someone has been moving money in small amounts to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts." "How much money are we talking about?" "So far, I can document almost $600,000 in suspicious transfers. The money was moved to accounts that were opened in Emma and Vernon's names, but with Patricia listed as the primary account holder." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. Patricia hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance. She had been stealing from my father for years while he was alive. "There's more," David continued. "The pattern suggests that whoever was doing this understood financial systems very well. They were staying just under the reporting thresholds and timing the transfers to coincide with market fluctuations to hide the missing money." I scheduled a meeting with David for the next day to review all the evidence in detail. Then I called Hartwell and shared what we had discovered. "This changes everything," Hartwell said, his voice tight with anger. "If Patricia has been committing elder financial abuse, we need to contact the authorities immediately." But before we could file any reports, I received an unexpected phone call that afternoon. The caller identified himself as Daniel Thompson, my father's younger brother, who had been estranged from our family for over a decade. "Mike, I've been trying to reach you since I heard about Joshua's death," Daniel said. His voice carried warmth that I hadn't heard from anyone in my family for years. "I'm sorry I wasn't at the funeral. Patricia told me it was family only, and she made it clear I wasn't welcome." I had barely spoken to Uncle Daniel since I was a teenager. He had gotten into some kind of argument with my father years ago, and Joshua had cut off all contact with his only brother. I never knew what the fight was about, but it had resulted in Daniel being completely excluded from family events. "I need to tell you something about your father," Daniel continued. "About 6 months before he died, he started calling me. He was concerned about Patricia's behavior and wanted advice about protecting his assets." My heart rate spiked. What kind of concerns? Joshua discovered that money was missing from his accounts. He had started documenting Patricia's access to his financial information and gathering evidence of unauthorized transfers. He was planning to divorce her and press charges for theft. This news hit me like a lightning bolt. My father had known about Patricia's crimes and had been taking action to stop her. "There's more," Daniel said. "Joshua also told me that he regretted how he had treated you over the years. He said Patricia had been filling his head with poison about you, making him believe that you didn't respect him or care about the family, but he was starting to see through her manipulation." Tears started forming in my eyes. "Are you sure about this? Mike, your father loved you. He was angry with himself for allowing Patricia to drive a wedge between you two. He was planning to reach out and try to rebuild your relationship after he got his financial situation sorted out." Daniel agreed to meet with me the next day and bring copies of text messages and voicemail recordings that Joshua had left for him in the months before his death. These communications would prove that my father had been trying to protect his assets from Patricia and that he had wanted to reconcile with me. That evening, something else unexpected happened. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson from the apartment next door, knocked on my door with a plate of homemade cookies and an envelope. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, dear," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she belonged there. "But I need to share something with you about your mother." Mrs. Henderson was in her 70s, with silver hair and gentle eyes that seemed to see everything. I had helped her with groceries and small repairs around her apartment for years, but we had never talked about anything deeply personal. "I knew your mother well when you were a little boy," she continued. "We used to have coffee together every Tuesday while you were at school. She talked about you constantly, always with such pride and love." She handed me the envelope, which contained several handwritten letters. "Sarah gave these to me shortly before she died. She asked me to keep them safe and give them to you if you ever needed them." I opened the first letter with trembling hands and immediately recognized my mother's handwriting. "My dearest Mrs. Henderson, if you are reading this to Mike, it means that something has happened to me, and he needs to know how much he was loved. Please tell him that he brought joy to every single day of my life. Please tell him that he has nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of. Most importantly, please tell him that if people ever try to hurt him, because he is different, it says everything about them and nothing about him." The letter continued. "I've made arrangements to protect Mike financially, but I'm worried about protecting him emotionally. Joshua loves him, but he sometimes lacks the courage to stand up to people who might pressure him to reject Mike. If anyone ever tries to make Mike feel unwelcome or unloved in his own family, please remind him that family is about love and support, not about DNA or tradition." Mrs. Henderson patted my hand gently as I wiped tears from my eyes. "Your mother knew you might face challenges because of who you are. She wanted to make sure you had people in your corner when things got difficult. Did you know about my transition?" She smiled warmly. "Honey, I've known you since you were 3 years old. I watched you become the confident, kind young man you were meant to be. Your mother handled everything with such grace and wisdom. She put your happiness and well-being above everything else." Mrs. Henderson agreed to testify on my behalf if Patricia tried to challenge my inheritance in court. She also offered to be a character witness if anyone questioned my integrity or identity. As she prepared to leave, she turned back to me with a serious expression. "Mike, those people who were here yesterday making threats, they showed their true character to everyone who witnessed that display. You don't need to hide from people like that. You need to stand up to them." That night, I reviewed all the evidence I had gathered: David's financial analysis showing Patricia's theft, Daniel's recordings proving my father wanted to reconcile with me Mrs. Henderson's letters, confirming my mother's protective intentions, and the documentation of Patricia's harassment and blackmail attempts. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I realized that I wasn't just a victim defending myself. I had the power to go on the offensive and expose Patricia for the criminal she was. Armed with evidence of Patricia's financial crimes and a growing network of unexpected allies, I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back. I scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office to file formal charges against Patricia for elder financial abuse, theft, and extortion. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Martinez reviewed the evidence with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. David's forensic analysis had uncovered even more financial irregularities. Patricia had stolen nearly $800,000 from my father over 5 years through a sophisticated scheme of small, frequent transfers. "This is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases I've seen," Martinez said, organizing the evidence into neat piles on her desk. "The pattern shows clear intent and premeditation. She knew exactly what she was doing." The investigation had revealed that Patricia understood financial systems much better than she pretended. Before marrying my father, she had worked as a bank manager for 12 years. She knew how to manipulate accounts and timing to avoid detection, and she had been training Emma and Vernon to help her launder the stolen money through their personal accounts. But the evidence that sealed Patricia's fate came from an unexpected source: my father himself. Daniel had provided access to Joshua's personal email account, which contained months of correspondence with a private investigator that Joshua had hired to document Patricia's theft. "Your father was building a case against his own wife," Martinez explained, showing me printed emails that made my chest tight with emotion. He had photographs of forged signatures, bank statements showing unauthorized access, and recorded phone calls where Patricia admitted to taking money that she claimed was owed to her. One email from my father to his investigator was particularly heartbreaking. "I need ironclad evidence before I confront Patricia, because she will try to turn my children against me. I also need to reach out to my son, Mike, and apologize for the terrible mistakes I've made. Patricia has been manipulating me for years, making me believe that Mike didn't care about our family. I see now that she was isolating me from the people who actually loved me." Martinez agreed to file formal charges against Patricia, Emma, and Vernon for conspiracy to commit theft, elder financial abuse, and extortion. The blackmail attempt against me provided additional charges of harassment and criminal intimidation. "We'll execute search warrants on all their properties and freeze their assets," Martinez explained. "If they've been living off stolen money, they're about to discover what financial hardship actually feels like." While the criminal case moved forward, I decided to take additional steps to protect myself and send a clear message that Patricia's intimidation tactics had failed completely. I hired a civil rights attorney named Rebecca Walsh, who specialized in discrimination cases involving LGBTQ individuals. Her job was to document the harassment I had received and file restraining orders against Patricia and her children. "What they did constitutes hate crime harassment in this state," Walsh explained during our first meeting. "Threatening to out someone's transgender status for the purpose of causing harm is specifically prohibited under our anti-discrimination laws." Walsh also helped me understand my rights as a transgender person in the workplace. When Patricia made good on her threat to contact my employer with revelations about my identity, my company's human resources department handled the situation exactly according to policy. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, called me into her office 3 days after Patricia's harassment campaign began. I expected the worst, but Janet surprised me with her professionalism and support. "Mike, we received some disturbing communications from someone claiming to have damaging information about your background," Janet said, closing her office door for privacy. "I want you to know that your personal medical history is none of this company's business, and anyone attempting to use private information to damage an employee's reputation will face legal consequences. It turned out that my company had comprehensive anti-discrimination policies specifically protecting transgender employees. Patricia's attempts to destroy my career had actually triggered corporate security protocols designed to protect employees from harassment. We're treating this as a criminal matter," Janet explained. "The person who contacted us made statements that could be interpreted as threats against you. We forwarded all communications to the police and our legal department. The support I received from unexpected places was overwhelming. Co-workers who barely knew me personally made a point of expressing their solidarity. The IT department implemented additional security measures to protect my personal information. Even the building security guards started checking on me more frequently to ensure my safety. But the most satisfying development came from Patricia's own hubris and greed. She had assumed that exposing my transgender identity would turn the entire community against me, but she had severely underestimated both my support network and the decency of ordinary people. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had witnessed Patricia's threats in my parking lot, organized a petition supporting me that was signed by 37 residents of my apartment complex. The petition condemned harassment and discrimination while expressing confidence in my character and integrity. My church, which I had been afraid to attend since Patricia's threats began, surprised me with overwhelming acceptance and support. Pastor Williams addressed the congregation directly saying, "We have heard rumors and accusations about one of our members. Let me be clear, this church welcomes everyone who seeks to live with faith, hope, and love. We do not tolerate harassment, discrimination, or cruelty toward any person for any reason." The tide had turned completely. Patricia's attempts to destroy my reputation had backfired so spectacularly that she was now facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and public condemnation for her behavior. The final blow came when David's forensic analysis revealed that Patricia had been planning to murder my father and make it look like a natural death. Hidden in her personal computer were internet searches about untraceable poisons, information about life insurance policies, and communication with someone who appeared to be offering murder-for-hire services. This case just became a potential homicide investigation. Martinez informed me during a phone call that made my blood run cold. "We're exhuming your father's body for toxicology tests and bringing in the FBI to investigate the murder-for-hire angle." Patricia was arrested 3 days later at her home, along with Emma and Vernon. The local newspaper covered the story with headlines that vindicated everything I had endured: local woman charged with elder abuse extortion and conspiracy to commit murder. The article detailed the financial crimes, the harassment campaign against me, and the evidence suggesting that Patricia had been planning to kill my father to access his life insurance money. There was no mention of my transgender identity, because it wasn't relevant to the criminal charges. As I watched Patricia being led away in handcuffs on the evening news, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months' peace. The woman who had tried to destroy my life was facing justice, and I was surrounded by people who cared about my well-being. But more importantly, I had learned something about myself that I would never forget. When people tried to use my identity as a weapon against me, I discovered that I was strong enough to fight back, and proud enough of who I was to refuse to be ashamed. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where Patricia had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, and hate crime harassment. Emma received 3 years of probation and 500 hours of community service, while Vernon got 18 months in minimum security prison for his role in laundering the stolen money. The judge had been particularly harsh with Patricia during sentencing, calling her crimes a betrayal of the most fundamental trust between family members, and noting that her harassment campaign against me demonstrated a level of cruelty that shocks the conscience. But the most meaningful moment of the entire legal process came during the victim impact statements, when something unexpected happened that changed everything. Daniel, my uncle, who had been estranged from our family for so long, asked permission to read a letter that my father had written shortly before his death. The letter had been found among Joshua's personal papers, sealed in an envelope marked, "For Mike, in case something happens to me." With the court's permission, Daniel stood up and read my father's final words to me. "Son, I need you to know that I failed you as a father, but not because of who you are. I failed you because I allowed fear and other people's prejudices to make me forget what was most important, loving and protecting my child. Your mother was braver and wiser than I ever was. She saw your strength and your goodness from the very beginning, and she raised you to be the exceptional man you became, despite my shortcomings." The letter continued. "I've learned that Patricia has been lying to me about you for years, making me believe that you didn't care about our family or respect me. I see now that she was trying to isolate me from the people who genuinely loved me. You never stopped being my son, Mike. I stopped being the father you deserved. By the time you read this, I hope I've had the chance to apologize in person and to rebuild our relationship. If I haven't had that opportunity, please know that I am proud of the man you've become. You have integrity, compassion, and courage that I wish I had possessed. Use your inheritance to build a life filled with people who appreciate you for exactly who you are." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when Daniel finished reading. Even the bailiff was wiping away tears. I felt a sense of closure and healing that I hadn't known was possible. Patricia showed no remorse during the entire proceedings. Even when given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, she maintained that she was the real victim, and that I had manipulated the legal system through deception about my gender identity. Her complete lack of accountability and continued cruelty only reinforced to everyone present that justice was being served appropriately. The financial restoration was swift and comprehensive. Patricia was ordered to pay full restitution, plus penalties, totaling nearly $2 million. Since she couldn't afford that amount, the court seized her house cars and all other assets to compensate my father's estate. Emma and Vernon, who had been living off the stolen money for years, suddenly found themselves facing real financial hardship for the first time in their adult lives. Vernon's truck was repossessed, and Emma had to drop out of graduate school because she could no longer afford tuition. But surprisingly, their changed circumstances led to something I hadn't expected: genuine apologies and efforts to make amends. Vernon reached out to me 6 months after his sentencing, asking if we could meet for coffee. I was skeptical, but curiosity won out over caution. "I've had a lot of time to think about what we did to you," Vernon said, his voice carrying a humility I had never heard before. I realized that we were never really angry about the inheritance. We were angry about having to face the truth about our mother and ourselves. He explained that living without stolen money had forced him to confront his own character and choices. "I never earned anything in my life. I just took what Patricia gave me without asking where it came from. When I finally got a real job and started working 40 hours a week, I understood what you went through your whole life." Emma's apology came in the form of a handwritten letter delivered by Daniel. In it, she acknowledged that her behavior had been motivated by jealousy and greed, rather than any legitimate grievance against me. "You always had qualities that I envied," she wrote. "You were independent, hardworking, and genuinely kind to people even when they didn't deserve it. Instead of trying to develop those qualities myself, I resented you for having them. I'm sorry for the pain we caused you, and I understand if you never want to speak to any of us again." I chose to forgive Vernon and Emma, but with clear boundaries. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what had happened, or pretending that our relationships could return to what they had been before. It meant releasing my anger and resentment so they couldn't poison my own happiness. With Patricia's criminal case resolved and my inheritance secure, I was finally free to build the life my mother had envisioned for me. The $23 million gave me opportunities I had never imagined possible, but more importantly, it gave me the security to live authentically and help other people facing similar challenges. I established the Sarah Thompson Foundation for Transgender Youth, providing financial support, medical resources, and legal advocacy for young people whose families had rejected them because of their gender identity. The foundation also offered scholarships for transgender students pursuing higher education and grants for families seeking to support their transgender children properly. The foundation's first major project was partnering with local schools to implement anti-bullying programs and provide training for teachers on supporting LGBTQ students. We also created a crisis intervention hotline for transgender teenagers facing family rejection or harassment. Within a year, the foundation had helped over 200 families and prevented dozens of suicide attempts among transgender youth. Every success story reminded me that my mother's sacrifice had created ripple effects of healing and hope far beyond her original intentions. I moved to a larger city where I could live more openly and connect with a broader community of people who shared my experiences and values. My new neighborhood included several other transgender individuals, and I found a sense of belonging that I had never experienced before. My career flourished as well. The financial security allowed me to take risks and pursue opportunities that I wouldn't have been able to afford before. I started my own accounting firm specializing in non-profit organizations and small businesses owned by marginalized communities. Most importantly, I learned to stop hiding parts of myself out of fear. When people asked about my background or family history, I answered honestly and confidently. Some people reacted with ignorance or prejudice, but most responded with acceptance or simple indifference that was more beautiful than any enthusiasm. 2 years after Patricia's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call from the State Attorney General's office. Patricia had finally confessed to planning my father's murder, providing details that led to the arrest of the person she had hired to carry out the killing. She realized that confessing might reduce her sentence, the prosecutor explained. She also wanted to make sure that you knew your father's death was not natural, in case you had any doubts about pursuing justice. The confession confirmed what I had suspected, but had been afraid to voice my father's heart attack had been chemically induced using a substance that mimicked the symptoms of natural cardiac arrest. Patricia had been slowly poisoning him for weeks before delivering the fatal dose. Learning that my father had been murdered was devastating, but it also provided a strange sense of relief. He hadn't chosen to die before we could reconcile. He had been working toward rebuilding our relationship when his life was cut short by someone who saw him only as an obstacle to money and control. The final resolution came when I visited my mother's grave on the 3rd anniversary of my father's death. I brought fresh flowers and a letter updating her on everything that had happened. "I understand now why you protected me the way you did," I said aloud, sitting beside her headstone. "You knew that some people would try to use my identity against me, but you also knew that I was strong enough to survive their attacks, and wise enough to build a life filled with people who would love me for exactly who I am." As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I noticed a couple visiting a nearby grave with their young son, who was maybe 7 years old. The child had long hair and was wearing a dress, but something about his body language and mannerisms reminded me of myself at that age. Without thinking, I approached the family and introduced myself. It turned out that they were struggling with their child's gender identity and were feeling isolated and confused about how to proceed. "Our son says he's really a boy." The mother explained, her voice filled with love and concern. "We want to support him, but we don't know how, and our families are pressuring us to ignore what he's telling us." I spent an hour talking with them about my own experience, my mother's support, and the resources available through my foundation. By the time we parted ways, they had contact information for specialists who could help them navigate their child's transition with confidence and love. Driving home that day, I realized that my mother's legacy was living on through every person I helped and every family I supported. She had given me more than money. She had given me the tools and the motivation to make the world a little bit safer for people like me. That evening, I sat in my home office working on plans for the Foundation's expansion into rural communities where transgender youth often faced the greatest challenges and had access to the fewest resources. My phone rang, and I saw Mrs. Henderson's name on the screen. She called me every few weeks to check in and share updates about our old neighborhood. "I have wonderful news," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "That nice young couple with the transgender son that you helped at the cemetery, they moved into Patricia's old house. Their little boy is thriving, and they're already talking about starting a support group for other families." I smiled, thinking about the perfect symmetry of a transgender child growing up safely in the house where someone had tried to destroy me because of my own gender identity. As I hung up the phone and returned to my work, I reflected on everything I had learned through this journey. I had discovered that real family consists of people who love and support each other unconditionally. I had learned that fighting for truth and justice, even when it's painful, honors the people who believed in us and protected us. Most importantly, I had learned that my identity wasn't something to be ashamed of or hidden, but something to be celebrated and shared with pride. My mother had known that I would face challenges because of who I was, but she had also known that I possessed the strength and character to overcome those challenges and help other people facing similar struggles. Her investment in my future had paid dividends beyond anything she could have imagined. I hope my story inspires you to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Have you ever had to fight for your right to be accepted for who you truly are? Share your experiences in the comments below, and let's support each other through the challenges we face. Please like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe for more stories about overcoming adversity, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you are worthy of love and acceptance exactly as you are. May you find the courage to live your truth and the wisdom to surround yourself with people who celebrate your authentic self.